For me, peace would look like a world without not only violence, but also without anyone in insecurity, be it like money, food, health, but definitely a world without war.
Peace to me is when everybody lives in harmony with each other. They communicate clearly and explain and express themselves so that there is no conflict or violence of any form.
Peace, for me, it's the achievement of people living a peaceful life. It's when there's no tensions. It's when, you know, we build things together. We build cities, communities, and populations, and we want to try to do it well without any kind of, you know, conflict or violence, and just in a peaceful way where people are, you know, just respectful from each other.
Peace looks like, to me, like a country or a place where people are not afraid of talking to each other, of exchanging things together, because you can have a place where there's no conflict, but it's not peaceful because you don't trust the people around you.
So there are different ways that we can talk about dealing with conflict. We often talk about conflict management, resolution, or transformation. At UNOY Peacebuilders, we often talk about transformation because we don't see conflict as necessarily a bad thing. We see it as this space where change happens, and this change can be either positive or negative depending on the way that you deal with it. And there are different ways that you can deal with it as well.
Right, yeah, I mean, we can, when we're faced with a conflict, as you say, we can take on different ways of dealing with it. I mean, we can avoid the conflict altogether. We can compete. We can accommodate. We can compromise, or we can collaborate. We have a choice.
And let's imagine that two friends want to go to the movies, and they can't agree on what to watch. How would those options kind of play out?
Right, so those two friends, they could decide to avoid the conflict altogether. They could just say, okay, we're not going to the movies, and just go and do something else. They could compete, they could fight, they could either argue or physically fight and to decide which movie will they see. One friend could also decide a path of avoidance, which would then mean basically saying to the other friend, hey, it's okay, I don't care, let's just see your movie. They could also compromise and see maybe half of one movie and then the other half of the other movie. But of course each of these outcomes leaves something to be desired. So there's also a fifth way, which is often what we seek when we seek conflict transformation, which is a collaborative approach to dealing with the conflict and trying to find a win-win outcome, which for the two friends would mean something like maybe seeing both movies at a different time.
So it seems like with conflict transformation, more than just trying to reach the right outcome for a conflict, is about the process and how this process will be dealt, and the process will mean and the outcome will also be meaningful.
Right, yeah, it's about the process, but the transformation is not just transforming the process, it happens at multiple levels. At Search for Common Ground we talk about a transformation of sort of how we see ourselves, how we perceive ourselves from being victims in a conflict to understanding that we are participants in it. A transformation of how we see the other actors in the conflict, from seeing them as enemies to seeing them as our allies and finding a solution or an outcome. A transformation of the relationships within the conflict to seeing those relationships as being centered on sort of joint efforts and working together, and then indeed the transformation of the process. And we need to, when we're dealing with, especially when we're dealing with complex conflicts, more tricky than maybe the one that we were talking about before with the friends in the movie, often we find that we need to work on all of these different levels to get a conflict transformation to really sort of come to life. I think it depends a bit on sort of your relationship to the conflict, right? So if you're outside of it, if you're sort of an outside observer, You're not a part of the conflict. You might even be able to look at it right away and see like, hey, here's a possible, solution or something we can work with to find a way out. Or you might be able to immediately start doing some sort of analysis of the situation. But of course, if you're inside the conflict, if you're part of the conflict, then that can be a lot harder. When you're within a conflict, often what you do is you take a position and you get sort of entrenched in that position, and you see really clearly the things that divide you from the people who have, or the person who, or the group that you are in conflict with, and it becomes really hard to see the things that maybe connect you with them. So often what you need to do is you need to start really by looking at yourself and looking at your own role in the conflict and thinking about how do I transform that, how do I transform my relationship with the other person, and how do I sort of change the way that I approach this. And when you do that, you can start analyzing, what's the conflict all about, what's driving it, what opportunities do we have here to deal with it.
Yeah, so it's also that in a conflict there's a lot happening, and there's usually this visible part that can be arguing, fighting, violence, and there's usually this invisible part that it's really the needs that people have and that need to be met. So like a root plant, that you have these leaves on the outside, and you look at it and you think that might be all, but underneath it there's a lot happening. And in this conflict, if you just want to address the leafy part, the part that you see, you might get people to kind of shake hands and stop fighting, but that usually doesn't solve the conflict. People after will go on fighting about it later on. But if we address the roots of it, which is what people really need, then it's more likely that it will not happen again, or if it comes up again, people will know how to deal with it because they will know what they really need to be met. And it's interesting because in situations of conflict, we usually think we know what we want out of it, and we think that we know, oh, this is the solution that is right for me, and any other solution is not feasible, I'm not going to accept, and then we lock ourselves in these positions that you were saying. But when we do reflect about it and we think what needs that I have here to be met, and I open myself to other kinds of solutions that not necessarily reach this one outcome that I find desirable, but that actually in other ways meet my needs, then we can start a dialogue, and we can start kind of finding more creative and alternative solutions. So people often ask us, how does this actually look like? How does it happen in practice? And that varies a lot. There are a lot of different ways that you can do conflict transformation depending on the context. But despite all these differences, there's also a lot of commonalities in all of these approaches. Right.
I mean, there's definitely some things that you very commonly see around the world in different types of conflict situations. So often you have activities that focus on, or conflict transformation activities that focus on working with the individual to sort of change how they see themselves. Sort of identity-related activities. You also have a lot of things like exchanges, whether that is in person or virtually online, where you get to meet the other, see the other, humanize the other, and maybe even find common shared interests, common ground, like for example playing football together. Or you go to mediation activities, advocacy, different ways to sort of influence relationships and processes that you see happening around the world.
Yeah, one example that we do have in our network is from our member called Bogotá, based in Colombia. And they are a youth-led organization using arts to transform conflict. And they had one project that was very interesting that was called Letters of Reconciliation. And in this project, young people would write letters to ex-combatants of paramilitary groups, to welcome them back in society. And this was a very powerful project because it was all about changing the perceptions. So the young people, they changed their perceptions from being victims of the conflict, victims of these paramilitary groups, to being active actors in transforming those relations in society. The paramilitary, on the other hand, they stopped seeing themselves as a part from society, to seeing themselves as a part of it and having a stake in it. And with that, the perceptions of the conflict changed from something that just goes on and on and on based on division and hate and something that cannot find a common ground, to the possibility of reconciliation and through memory and dialogue, these different groups coexisting and dealing with their different interests in a peaceful way.